So a few weeks ago, I published a video about how much I made as a vintage reseller and YouTuber, and you guys loved that video. Everyone's feedback was so positive. The love I got on that video was absolutely tremendous. I was so nervous to post that video. I just was, of course, like I'm sharing very vulnerable information about my income, and I almost didn't publish it. And I'm so grateful that I did because the feedback that I got was amazing. As I was looking at the comments of that video, I noticed a trend. There were so many of you wanting to start a reselling business, you just didn't know how to get started. And you wanted to know if I had any tips to help you kind of take that next step. So rather than respond to everybody's comments individually, I thought it would be a perfect topic for my channel. So in today's video, you're gonna learn how to take that step, how to get started as a vintage reseller this year. So because I'm a marketing professional by day and I've spent many years in the corporate world, I have an outline of all the things we're gonna talk about today. So we're gonna focus a lot on the pain points, so the things that people are worried about and are preventing them from actually taking the step to starting the reselling business. And then we're gonna talk about kind of all the different ways you can sell vintage, because there are many ways to sell vintage and each of them have pros and cons. So we're gonna talk about those. So we have a lot to cover today. Let's jump right in. So before you start your business, you really need to have accomplished two tasks. One is your business needs a name. You have to have a name for your business. I'm always surprised how many people that start their business and they actually don't have a formal name for it. And then the second must for your reselling business is inventory. So you have to have things to sell. Now, I know most of you out there are probably thrifters. You love to go to estate sales. So you probably have inventory. So you can check that off right now. So just make sure that before you even get started down the process of becoming a reseller, you need to think of a name, and then you also have to have inventory. So now we're gonna get into the pain points, all the barriers that keep people from starting their business. And this applies to a lot of businesses, not just reselling. Things like confidence, imposter syndrome, your lack of tech skills, just the mysterious world of shipping, pricing. Like some people are paralyzed because they just don't know if they're going to be able to price their stuff. And then of course the taxes and legals, that also, makes people nervous about starting a business. And then of course, just perfection in general. A lot of times people don't want to start something until they feel like they have this perfect entity to then put out into the world. And so that's another paralyzing thing for people. So the first thing I want to talk about is confidence and imposter syndrome. So one thing I want you to remember is you do not need to be an expert at anything when you're starting a business, and no one expects you to do it perfectly. Every business, whether it's like a multi-billion-dollar business or a small business like you're thinking about starting, they all have like moments of failure. They have moments of triumph. That's just part of the process. And so you just need to accept that that is going to be in your journey, and you can always pivot and change. And so you shouldn't let the fear of failure or just the fear of putting yourself out there prevent you from doing your business. Because I can tell you right now, no one is going to be paying attention to your business as much as you are. And so really, you just have to prove to yourself that you can do it versus anyone else. So don't let a lack of confidence and imposter syndrome prevent you from starting your business. You're absolutely capable of doing it. So the next barrier I want to talk about is tech, because so many people just feel like they are not great at technology. And so that's preventing them from becoming a reseller. There are so many ways to sell vintage that don't involve any sort of real tech, like markets or your vintage booth. And so if technology is not your thing, don't feel pressured to necessarily be on social media or to be on an online platform like Etsy or eBay. You don't have to choose that route. You can choose a route that's a little bit tech easy. But I will mention that AI and YouTube and blog posts, there are so many resources that can answer your questions. And I find that so many people, when they are really nervous about technology, they're worried about making a mistake, and there are no mistakes that you can't overcome. And so I wouldn't let your nervousness around technology hold you back from maybe exploring some of these other options like selling online, because when you sell online, the world is your customer versus when you sell in person, you're limited to the foot traffic that is coming to your booth space or your market. So I wouldn't recommend ever discounting that, because I feel like every tech concern can absolutely be overcome. So if tech is your barrier, either pay someone to do it for you or give you a tutorial, or choose a selling channel that doesn't require you to do a lot of tech. So the next barrier I want to talk about is shipping. So many people are worried about shipping things. I was very worried in the beginning of my reselling journey. I didn't almost want to make a sale because I was so scared as soon as something would sell on my Etsy shop, I'd have to ship it. And I was like, oh my God, I got to put it in a box. I got to buy a label. It all was so much. And so now that I've shipped out, you know, thousands of things. It's so easy, but I know in the beginning it was very paralyzing. And so I think that's a big barrier for anyone who wants to sell online. But there are so many tutorials out there. I actually have done a few shipping videos, which I can link down below and I'll pop on the screen. It's definitely a barrier you can easily get over. And if you don't want to ship something, because I have so many reselling friends that just refuse to ship, you don't have to sell your stuff online. You can sell at a market, or you can sell in a vintage booth. You can sell on Facebook Marketplace. There are ways you can sell vintage without having to ship. I will say though, being online opens you up to the world, all the customers, and so that's why learning how to ship is very important to me in terms of like maximizing your potential, your profit potential, but you absolutely do not have to do it. So don't let that be a barrier. So the next barrier is pricing. And I will say, even though I have listed and sold thousands of things, pricing stuff is still tricky. I think it's always going to be a bit tricky. I think it's because as a vintage reseller, you're bringing in stuff that is different all the time, and the price you pay for those items can vary. One day I can find a brass animal for under $10. The next day it's $20. I mean, it's just, there's so much that goes into pricing. I actually have a video about my pricing strategy that I will link down below, because it's just, there's a lot to it. But I will say we all price things wrong on occasion. That's just part of the process. I know when I went back and looked recently at some of my earlier listings and I look at the price that I put on them, it was so low and so not the right pricing. I'm just like, oh my gosh, I sold that piece for that much money. Like that buyer got a deal. And so we all have those moments. And then sometimes we'll overprice thing and you know, the item doesn't sell until we lower the price. That's kind of just part of the process. So I wouldn't let pricing your items like paralyze you. You just have to do your research. You know, obviously look at comps, so comparable items. And even then there's a range and you just have to pick it. And then you just have to make sure like how much did you pay for it, and can you make money off of that based on how much it's going for. So there's ways to, you know, figure out the pricing, but just know that you'll always question your pricing. I feel like we all do that. Anytime I go into my vintage booth and I am talking to other resellers, I'm like, do you think this price makes sense? And then they're like, I guess so. I mean, that is literally the conversations that we're having. So we're making a very good educated guess based on like the item and the quality, the maker, you know, where we're selling it, how much we have invested in it. And so that's just all you can do. So do not let pricing hold you back, because just know we're all kind of always just trying to figure it out. So the next barrier I want to talk about is a little bit more serious, and that is taxes and legals. Now, I'm not a tax professional and I'm not a legal expert, so I can't really give you any sort of advice on how you personally should be setting up your business, because that depends on so many things. But I do feel like too many people go into business not thinking about how it's going to affect their taxes, not looking into any sort of legal requirements in their area, like do they need a business license to do what they're doing? And so I feel like it's worth exploring those before you kind of get started. I think a lot of people forget that they have to report their income or pay taxes and all of the legal implications. I don't think it should be a barrier to entry at all, because it's something you can absolutely figure out. And there's always professionals you can pay to help you. But I think it's something you should definitely look into before starting your business. So I feel like this barrier is one that you should maybe like take a pause at, consider it before you get started. The final barrier is very similar to the first one, which is perfection. People think they need to have the perfect name for their business and the perfect logo and brand and the perfect inventory and the perfect everything. And that perfection and that striving for perfection absolutely paralyzes them and prevents them from even starting their business, because they just feel like they can't do it unless everything is exactly aligned. And it will never be exactly aligned, because starting a business is messy. Running a business is messy. The whole process is very imperfect. I'm sorry to warn you, but it is. I don't know anyone running a perfect business. And so I would hate that like unrealistic level of perfection is preventing you and causing you to resist actually starting. And so you got to throw all those expectations away, and you just have to do as good as you can in the moment. Okay, so now we're gonna shift gears and talk about all the different ways that you can sell vintage, all the different channels and the pros and cons of each. So to me, by far, the easiest way to dip your toe into being a vintage reseller is to sell directly on Facebook Marketplace. So the reason I think this is so low barrier is, one, most people are users of Facebook. Even if you don't have an account right now, you probably have had an account in the past. And because so many people have been on that platform, there are a million people that can answer your questions on how to sell there. And so I feel like the education is out there and the help is out there. And that's why I feel like it's such a low barrier platform to sell on. So one thing I want to make sure you guys are aware of, if you sell on Facebook Marketplace, you're either accepting payment by cash or through some sort of payment app like Venmo. You just want to make sure that you are reading and understanding the terms of service for those apps, because transferring money between person and person, there's no fees associated with that. But anytime you're doing any sort of business transaction, that usually requires a different type of account. So you just want to make sure that you're aware of that. And then also you're paying the fees that are appropriate for the type of business that you're doing. So next I want to talk about selling online. So I'm a huge advocate for selling online. Obviously I have an Etsy shop. I've been selling on Etsy for a long time. What I love about selling online is there are very few upfront costs. So you may not even pay anything to list your item on the platform, or it's a very small fee, like Etsy, it's 20 cents. And so I love that, because when you're starting a business, you don't want a lot of upfront expenses, and you want to kind of make sure you like what you're doing and you can actually make money on it before you're, investing a lot of money in it. And selling online is really that perfect place to do that. So kind of the cons to selling online is, one, you have to ship. So you have to be comfortable with shipping. And then you also have the tech piece of it too. So you have to be a little bit more tech savvy, because some of the platforms are a little involved when you're setting up your account. Others are very easy. Some are app-based. Others, you're doing a lot more on your desktop, because like the full functionality of the platform lives on your desktop versus on the app. And so you do need to be a little bit more tech savvy when you're selling online. But like I mentioned before, there are so many tutorials and so much help out there that I feel like you can easily overcome any of those barriers. But yeah, selling online is really great. It's definitely one of my favorite ways, because it opens your audience and your customer base up to the world, basically. And so your earning potential is that much higher. So next I want to talk about a vintage booth. So I have 2 vintage booths. I love selling in a curated, branded space. It's such a fun, creative exercise for me. And then it also allows me to sell things that it just doesn't make sense to sell online, that I just do not want to ship, or the price point doesn't make sense. So I do love having both online and a vintage booth. One thing great about a vintage booth is it's really kind of easy to get started. You just have the inventory and the display pieces, and then you just put them in, and you can add to it as you go. It's great. That way you can just keep tweaking, keep changing it, and it evolves as your business evolves. One of the cons to having a vintage booth is usually you have to pay upfront rent, and then you have continued rent as you go. And on top of that, you often have to pay the antique mall or the store a percentage of your sales. And so there are a lot more fees to selling in person. And so often I hear from people that they just aren't even making rent. So they're not even selling enough in order to actually pay the cost of having their stuff in that store. And so that's a problem. And that's one of the downsides of a vintage booth. And now I will eventually film a video about like vetting antique malls and making sure you're choosing the right place to sell your stuff. But just know that the con of that, the biggest con of that, is that you are paying a lot more money up front, and you will continually pay that, and you're usually locked into a contract. And so those are the things you need to know going into it. But in terms of just easy breezy getting it started and just ease of having it, it's definitely something that really anyone can do, because it usually doesn't require any sort of tech component of it. And then one other thing I wanted to mention is that oftentimes there are wait lists. So even if you decided to like, oh my gosh, I actually want to do a booth, selling online sounds complicated. A booth sounds exactly what I can do, because I can just devote time to it when I have it. It's perfect. I want to have an antique booth. And then you go to your local antique mall and they have a wait list. So just know that a lot of the really good antique malls, and this obviously depends on where you live, will have wait lists. I was on a wait list for years for one of my booth spaces. And so just know that that can definitely happen. And then sometimes you're required to have a smaller space in the mall that may or may not be like financially advantageous, because having a small space like a bookshelf oftentimes doesn't have the turnover to actually like make you any money. But sometimes you have to pay your dues in those little spaces before you get a big dedicated space. And then sometimes if it's a mall that's very aesthetically driven or does really well, they want to make sure you are going to be bringing your A game. And so some malls, it's a hot mess and they don't care what you sell. And other malls are like, we want to see your merchandise. We want to know what you're doing, what your concept is, because they have to approve you. So those are some things to consider when you're doing a vintage booth. There's pros and cons, but in terms of like no tech and just something that you can build as you go, it's the perfect place. So next I want to talk about in-person markets. Now I know a lot of resellers that an in-person market is the first time they ever sold any sort of vintage. That's how they got into reselling, is they decided to, on a whim, sign up for a vintage market. They had a booth, and that's how they got into it. So vintage markets are great because you can very easily test pricing and your product strategy and your merchandising, strategy. It's a really great testing place. The problem with markets is they are very expensive, usually upfront. They can cost hundreds of dollars in order to even have a booth. And sometimes that investment doesn't, pay you back. You may not sell enough to cover your rent for that event. You also need to make sure you're able to process payments on your own. So you definitely have to be a little tech savvy. I mean, certainly you can accept just cash, but you definitely cut down your customer if you only accept cash, because people largely want to pay by credit card. And then you also have to get your stuff there. And so oftentimes people are renting, a van or a U-Haul, and, there's added expense. So I don't always recommend a market as a person's first time doing something, just because I know how stressful it is and I know how expensive it can be to do, but they can be really, really fruitful, because while you're there, the connections that you're making with the community there are wonderful. I know people that the reason they got their vintage booth was because they had a proof of concept in their booth at that market, and someone who was from that antique mall saw their space and was like, we have a space opening up. You would be perfect for a mall, and that's how they got that opportunity. So there are many marketing benefits to doing a vintage market or a flea market. Just know that there are a lot of barriers to doing a market, but they definitely can be very, very beneficial. So the final way you can sell your vintage I want to talk about, and this is something that's very, very popular and has become even more popular every year, and that is live selling. Some people sell directly on social media. They do lives on like Instagram, or other people will use an app to do their live sales. So live sales is something you definitely can consider. I think that there's a lot of barriers to doing that, because one, you have to be comfortable on camera, and a lot of people just do not want to be on camera. You also have to know the platform. So you have to be really, really organized and savvy with tech. And then you also have to have a following. And that's one thing that I see often that breaks my heart. Someone will start an Instagram account. They'll have like less than 100 followers, and they'll do like a drop, and then no one will buy. And that's because they don't have enough people looking at their stuff. And so that's one thing that I'm just like, you set yourself up for success. So live sales, are something that absolutely people, should consider, because I know people can run through like 50 pieces in a live sale and just sell, and it can be quite the moneymaker for them, but I just know the barrier is really high. I think some of the other ways to sell are definitely better and easier, and don't have the requirements of having a very large following. So I feel like to be successful with live sales, and if you are a live seller and you think differently, let me know down below. But in my experience, the people that I see that try to do this type of reselling, because it is so popular and they see enough people doing it, and they think if they have something that's very aesthetic and the product is good, that it will just sell somehow, even though they don't have a following and they're not promoting it adequately to a large audience. And so if you have a big audience and following, then live sales and things like that are so much more fruitful, because more people are going to be showing up for it. I think it's something to add once you kind of dip your toe in another channel. Okay, so that is everything I wanted to talk about today. I'm hoping it's helpful for you guys, and it helps you think about the ways that you can get started, help you overcome some of your barriers, and also help you identify what is the best platform to get started on. So I know I came at you with a lot, so if you have any questions on what I talked about today or any further explanation, just let me know, because I can always film a follow-up video. So down below in the description, I will link some of my shipping tutorials. I'll link my pricing video. I'll link my income video. So if you did not catch how much I made as a vintage reseller YouTuber video, it's a really fun watch, and it definitely gives you more insight into my business. I'll link that down below too. Thank you so much for watching today, and I can't wait to see you in my next video. Take care.